Alright guys, I wanted to do a short video for you on small-scale rodent breeding. This is not going to be aimed at anyone looking to create a huge supply of rodents or a commercial rodent breeding program or anything like that. This is going to be designed for people that have a few snakes they want to feed, or let's say you're a snake breeder and you sometimes have snakes that are picky eaters and need a supply of pinkies to get them started. I find that's a pretty common problem, and a lot of times your local supplier may not be super reliable. They may not have the size you need all the time. They may not be available when it's a good time for you. So I just think it's a really good idea for everyone who breeds snakes and might have some finicky eaters to have at least some of their own rodent supply. So I'm going to go over some things I've learned doing this for the past few years. And the first thing is I tried to build my own cages out of plastic tubs and things. You can do that. It will work, but it's a lot of work, and sometimes there can be problems, things you learn along the way, like don't use plastic zip ties because rodents can chew through them, like I did. So what I do is, even though they are fairly expensive, I buy these lab-style cages. You can get them at Reptile Basics. LLL Reptile, I believe, also carries them. And you're seeing two sizes here. This is the small size is what's called the mouse breeding cage, and the slightly larger one there, or actually substantially larger cage there, is called the rat breeding cage. I actually recommend the rat breeding cage even for mice. I find because it sets up a little bit taller with the clamps and stuff there. I haven't had any hoppers get out of that one. I have had a few hoppers get out of the small style cage, although I'm not sure if maybe they rebuilt it. The last couple of litters I had, I didn't have an escape, but I have had in the past escapes from there. I like to put a little bit of bedding in there, quite a bit. Maybe the bedding was just high enough, that's what allowed the escape, but I like to have a decent amount of bedding in my cages so that it doesn't get saturated with urine quite so fast. So I really recommend going with a rat style cage, even if you're going to breed mice. I just feel like it's a little more humane to give them a little more room to move around and stuff. The mouse breeding cage will work. You can do a pair or a trio in there. It's just they won't have a lot of room to move around. Either one will potentially work. Just know with a small mice breeding cage, even though it's less expensive, they have less room to move around, and also it is possible you might get some hopper mice to manage to get out of there potentially. Um, what I like to do with these cages with the mice, I haven't had very good luck at all keeping large colonies of mice together. Inevitably, somebody always eats the other one's babies, and there's constant squabbles. What I found works much better for me, and I would have been recommending to other people, is to use trios of mice that have been raised together for quite a long time. When I keep them in trios in these larger rat style cages, I have had no problems whatsoever at all. I don't think I've had a single baby, or very rarely, I'll very rarely have had babies eaten. I certainly haven't had a whole litter eaten since I switched to that method. So it's not just the lines, it's also how you're keeping them. I start them together at a young age. I just keep them together, and as long as you keep them together, you don't move them around, I don't think you'll have any of the problems you often hear people complaining about with mice. Now, for rats, I actually don't like either of these cages. I think they're both too small. I think it's a little bit inhumane to keep them in there. Not saying you can't do it, not saying they won't breed, but we're going to look at the next cage. This is the large style, or this is what's called the rat cage on the left. You see I've got some mice in there. On the right, what's called the extra large rat cage, and that's what I like for rats. I feel like that gives them just enough room to move around. You can keep a trio of rats in there and they'll be comfortable. Another thing I like better about this extra large rat cage, besides the extra space, is it has spots for 2 water bottles instead of 1. These water bottles, particularly when you're dealing with the rats, will go down very, very fast. With the trios of mice, I find a water bottle lasts quite a few days, so it's not a big problem. But when you have a lot of rats, or even let's just say you have a trio of rats, one of those water bottles does not last long at all. So you definitely want to have 2 of those so they're not running out all the time. And in fact, if you're breeding any real number of rats beyond just maybe a handful of these cages, I would look into one of the bucket watering systems, because it really is quite a lot of work. With just a trio of rats, I have to change, even with 2 water bottles, I have to change them every few days. I mean, maybe like 3 days tops, and I'm having to switch these guys out again. So it would be quite a problem if you had a large number. I think it would make it difficult to go away on, even for a few days on a trip or something like that without worrying about them running out of water. The food hoppers work well. I haven't had any issues with those. The food hoppers that I fill up, even with this extra large cage and trio rats, I don't have to fill it up that often. Maybe, I don't know, once a week or so, once every 5 days, I might have to fill it up. And fill it up all the way to the top. It'll last several days, so that works pretty well there. And of course, once you have your rats and your cages, you're going to need some bedding. I use the white bedding from TSC. It's basically a Kenland dried pine. If you're using pine, you do want to make sure it's Kenland dried so it's safe for the rodents. That's what pretty much everyone I know uses, that same stuff. It's inexpensive. You get a big bale of it for just $5 or something, and change that out pretty often. A lot of people, you like to use another product which you can also get at Tractor Supply Company or in other feed stores. I'm sure have the same thing. Is going to be a horse stall. It's called a horse stall freshener. Basically, I believe it's zeolite, and the one I use is called Sweet PDZ. So in the bottom of the cage, before I put the Tractor Supply Kenland dried pine in there, I just take a little cup, not very much, just a small amount of that Sweet PDZ, and spread that around on the bottom. You don't need a lot, but that zeolite, what that does is it locks up some of the odor-causing ammonia inside of there, so it won't smell quite as badly if you do that. The main thing that makes rodents smell is when moisture builds up on the bottom of those cages. That's when you're going to get the bacteria that start breaking down the waste and the pee and all of that, and it's going to smell bad fast. So that's why you got to change your bedding pretty frequently, and you want to make sure you get everything off the bottom, get that bottom completely dry again, and then put the Sweet PDZ down. That'll help a little bit, cut down on some of the smells that are coming off there. Put the pine on top, and you're good to go. The other thing that can affect the smell too is the food that you're feeding your rodents. Now, there's a lot of different foods people have had success with, and some people say it's kind of all over the map. Some people say I have great success with this, other people say great success with that. But the one thing is you want to make sure that you're feeding an appropriate diet for the rodent. So, check on forums, make sure whatever you're giving them is recommended for rodents. You got to make sure it doesn't have any red dyes in it. You want to make sure it has the right ingredients so that it's suitable for rodents. The one I'm using here in this picture is a rodent pellet. I believe this one's called HPS. I've also heard of people using different ones from Kent. I know makes one that's tends to be affordable, and Missouri, of course, is the one, probably the most popular one. You can go to your local feed supply stores and ask them to order it for you. That's probably going to be the cheapest way to get rodent feeds. Figure out which rodent feeds they can order for you. If they're unwilling or unable to order one for you, I know Reptile Basics has this HPS that you can order. It's going to be a little bit expensive because if you're having to have it shipped to you, it's going to add to the cost. Another avenue, if you have any rodent breeders in your area, you might ask them, if you can buy some of their feed. I know there's one not too far from me that sells it for, I think it's $25 for a 40-pound bag. So that's a lot less expensive than buying little boxes of food for sure. The other thing is you got to have somewhere to store the food where other rodents and things won't get into it. Because again, making this more geared towards a smaller scale, I would use these bucket top lids. You can order these on Amazon. I'll provide a link in the description. Basically, on the top of the bucket, these are 5-gallon buckets, you put this little rim, and then that lid will twist on top. It makes a airtight or nearly airtight seal, and at least in my experience, that keeps the rodents out. I haven't had anything gnaw through there. It's pretty tough plastic, so something might be able to get in there, but it's gonna take a lot of work. And honestly, if you have that many rodents running around your rodent room that they could have the time and energy to chew through there, you probably need to invest in some rodent traps, because there are diseases that can affect humans that wild rodents can bring in and contaminate your rodent stock with, like hantavirus. So that's another good thing to do, is have a few, maybe some of those sticky traps or other rodent traps around your rodents. You don't want wild rodents getting in there and eating the food. It's going to waste food at the very least, and at the worst, it's going to spread a disease into your colony, which could ultimately affect you or your snakes. Speaking of the smell of rodents, we touched on it earlier with the sweet PDZ and changing out the pine. It's a good idea to bring in fresh air if you can. Now, this is a little fan I got from Tractor Supply, or I actually got that at Lowe's, I believe, but you can get these exhaust fans anywhere. And you see I've just hooked it up to a little bit of tubing, and that is venting outside. Um, so basically, what I haven't done yet on the outside, I've actually seen some, they have like a flap so that, when the air pushes it open, it opens that flap. Um, but I don't have that, but it doesn't really seem to affect the temperature in here too much. But a good fan like that, just blowing, that one there I believe is 130 CFM, and that seems to be enough to help in this little closet here's big walk-in closet actually I have these rodents in. Seems to be enough airflow to keep it smelling pretty fresh in there. If you don't want to run an exhaust fan because maybe it's winter or maybe it's summer, you don't want to blow your hot or cold air out, I do have an additional recommendation, and I'll provide a link for this in the description, and that is a carbon scrubber. These carbon scrubbers basically pull air in through. You see it's got this white wrapping around it. It's a pre-filter, so that rodent rooms, because all the food and stuff tend to get dusty, so the pre-filter, it's pulling the air in through that pre-filter, and most of the dust will get caught in that white pre-filter there, so that it doesn't clog up your system. Then behind that pre-filter, what you don't see is there's a metal, basically a metal can that's holding a lot of carbon in it. It's pretty heavy. I mean, it's probably more than 10 pounds worth of carbon. And as the air gets pulled through that carbon, it absorbs a lot of the ammonia and a lot of things that cause the smells. Now, I will tell you, I first tried a less expensive carbon scrubber. And this one wasn't expensive. I think this is about $120. But I tried a less expensive one first, hoping that would help, and it did not work at all. I almost gave up on carbon scrubbers because it worked so badly. I tried to use one that I think was A, too small, and B, I didn't buy the fan that was made for that unit. I think that may have had effect also. So if you're going to buy one of these carbon scrubbers, I would just go ahead and get the fan that's made to use for it. That's the one they're going to have tested it with in their lab. That's the one that I know it's going to pull the air through at about the right flow rate. And it's basically going to be guaranteed to work with the unit. And the other thing with the carbon scrubbers, you got to make sure the one you order is large enough to do what you need. So don't get a 4-inch. That's going to be too small, even for just a few rodents. Get a 6-inch at the minimum. If you're doing more than just a few tubs, go ahead and go with an 8-inch. It's always better to go too high than too low. Be advised, though, these fans will make a little bit of noise. But if you have in a closet or something, it shouldn't be too bad. Don't put it somewhere where you're going to be on talking on the phone in the same room. That would probably make a phone conversation hard to hear if you're standing right next to it. So that's just a little bit of information about rodents, how I breed them, everything like that. If it makes any difference to anyone, I found rats to be a little bit easier than mice. Rats just seem to get along a little bit better in my experience. Rats also provide a larger, everything from the pinky out the gate is larger. So if you're needing to feed something that's a little bit larger, you're probably going to want to go with rats. I find rats a little bit easier. Mice are easy also, provided you set your groups up and then just leave them alone. If you're trying to take mice and move them around from cage to cage, if you're trying to mix and match and mess with them a lot, if you're trying to take adults from one cage and put them in another cage, I think you're going to have a lot of problems. I think you're going to have mice fighting. I think you're going to have babies eaten. And that's where a lot of people get into trying to buy a certain line that they're able to get away with with. I find it's easier. Forget about the lines. Just house them the way they don't fight, and then you don't have to worry about it. If you're keeping a male and 2 females, or maybe you might even be able to get away with 3 females in one of those larger rat cages, and you set them up from the time they're subadults and just leave them alone, I don't think you'll have any problems. I've started numerous different lines doing it this way for the past little bit now, and I've had none of my problems have resurfaced. So that is, in my opinion, the way to go. We covered some other things. You want to get a carbon scrubber or vent air outside. Use the pine shavings. Make sure they're kindling dried. Use sweet PDZ underneath of those to help control the smell. If you're breeding more than just a few tubs worth of rats, consider investing in a bucket watering system. You can also get those at Reptile Basics, or you can do DIY, whichever one you want. Lab cages are great if you're only breeding a few rodents that last a long time. Just don't smack them against something. You can shake them, hard, but don't smack them against the concrete like I did. They will crack in that, but otherwise they last a long time. I haven't had anything chew through them. So that's my advice for rodent breeding. Thanks a lot for listening.